According to Snyder and Company, caffeine differs from adenosine in that caffeine does what? And just glancing at these answer choices, they all look very scientific and complex. We're going to try to see if we can get the answer by focusing in on sections in the passage that talk about Snyder first, and then seeing if we can kind of figure out what the difference is between caffeine and adenosine. So they first talk about Snyder here, and we read a little bit to see if they talk about caffeine and adenosine. You know, adenosine normally depresses neuron firing in many areas of the brain. You know, we don't talk about caffeine until here, and we know that Snyder is mentioned again, so this is a important sentence to read. The Snyder and caffeine are both mentioned here, as well as adenosine. Snyder and Company proposed that caffeine, which is structurally similar to adenosine, now we have a similarity, we're trying to find a difference. Caffeine is able to bind to both types of receptors, which prevents adenosine from attaching there and allows the neurons to fire more readily than they otherwise would. So it seems to be that caffeine prevents adenosine from attaching. So maybe they may be competing for the same spot. And we jump around Snyder. Do we see anything related to caffeine and adenosine? Not here. Snyder, caffeine, and adenosine here. Snyder compared the stimulatory effects of a series of caffeine derivatives with their ability to dislodge adenosine from its receptors in the brains of mice. So again, saying the same thing, saying that caffeine or even its derivatives try to dislodge adenosine from receptors. So again, caffeine seems to be competing with adenosine or kicking them out. And lastly here, no, we don't see caffeine and adenosine talked about there. So from general reading those two spots, they talked about caffeine kicking adenosine out. Now let's look at our answer choices. Stimulates behavior in the mouse and in humans, whereas adenosine stimulates behavior in humans. Now we don't have any idea of kicking out, so we don't want to prove this is true or false yet. This requires research, so we're just going to skip it for now. Has mixed effects in the brain, whereas adenosine only has a stimulatory effect. Again, this requires research to tell us whether adenosine only has a stimulatory effect. We don't want to go into that research right now. Increases cyclic AUMP concentrations in target neurons, whereas adenosine decreases such concentrations. Again, that requires some research, and from the times in the passage that we saw where they talked about Snyder, adenosine, and caffeine all together, they did not mention that. So, that requires research. Let's skip it. Permits release of neurotransmitters when it is bound to adenosine receptors, whereas adenosine inhibits such release. Now, according to Snyder, caffeine differs from adenosine in that caffeine permits release of neurotransmitters when it is bound to adenosine receptors. Now that was mentioned here, whereas adenosine inhibits such release. And we see that mentioned here in this sentence here, that caffeine is able to bind to both types of receptors, which prevents adenosine from attaching there and then allows neurons to fire. So it's basically saying that it's permitting the release of neurotransmitters, and that's what caffeine does. And when it is bound to adenosine receptors, whereas adenosine inhibits such release. And we know from here when we first read that adenosine here inhibits the release of those neurotransmitters, whereas caffeine allows those neurons to fire. So that seems to be true. We know that just by looking in the section where they talked about Snyder and they started talking about adenosine and caffeine all mixed together, that this one seems to make sense, that caffeine permits release of neurotransmitters whereas adenosine inhibits. That's a true statement. We didn't look here whether those are true or false, but we know that this is true because it's within the context or the section where they start talking about what Snyder said. And this question is saying according to what Snyder said. So that's key. We can kind of keep that for now. inhibits both neuron firing and production of phosphodiesterase when there is a sufficient concentration in the brain, whereas adenosine inhibits only neuron firing. Now, we see that adenosine depresses neuron firing, whereas, that's true, but is it true that caffeine inhibits both neuron firing and, well, we see that caffeine allows neurons to fire more, not inhibit, so E is just wrong. So these require more research, and they also are not related to what Snyder thinks. D is only one where it talks about what Snyder thinks and is also true, so I would go with D as the correct answer.